Thanks for joining us. So as promised, we are doing a little session of just kind of talking. This is sort of long-form podcast style discussion on some of the questions that came up during our Love University series. So yeah, we're gonna get into it. We've had a really good, it's been about 3 months series or so here on Love University, and somehow we still didn't get to some things, right?
Yeah.
So, and actually, I mean, really, when we think about our individual teachings and the different things that we went through, there is a lot to it, right?
Yeah.
Like there's a lot to think about.
Love's a pretty deep stuff.
Love is kind of like a big deal, right? It is, and that's one of the things that we sort of emphasize was that love is kind of the whole thing. It's really what God is after in the end. So we got some good questions in, and I've kind of taken some liberties with sort of steering them and grouping them a little bit in different ways. But really, in our series, we started out with a few weeks, probably about 4 weeks or so, where the focus of it was mainly on how we can become more and more sure about God's love for us, because that is the source. So like whatever we decide to do with love, we know that we can't do it unless God is actually in the middle of that He's pouring into us to start with. So we want to start with a question along those lines. This one says, "It's difficult to believe in my heart God loves me, but my head feels it's true. How can I move from my head to my heart when my life has been in devastating turmoil for years?" So that's a pretty good question, I think. What do you guys think? Who wants to go first?
I think it's a good question. I think that I would say that for me anyway, I think for a while there when I had times in which that life kept going sideways and circumstances seemed really unfair and I got beat up a lot, I had thought, well, God, you could change this, right? But I think it took me quite a while to learn how to turn to God in that and then discover who He was when I turned to Him. And each time I turned to Him, I could look in retrospect and say, oh, He was good and the world is unjust, but He remains good. But I don't think, it took me quite a few rounds before I could start believing that.
So kind of the circumstances sort of naturally drive whether you feel like God loves you or not in a lot of ways.
Well, I think I was taught a lot, even in the church, that if you follow God, then you will have better circumstances. It may not have been so explicit as some churches, but it was pretty much that your life will get better circumstantially if you follow God.
Yeah.
And that was the assumption. And so when that starts not happening, it causes you to think, well, what's happening and why God's allowing this? Where I started really understanding that, well, if you look at the Bible, that just doesn't hold up. But I'd grown up that way, so it was hard for me to. It took time to realize, okay, the world is unjust and life is rough, but God's good. But I knew that and I'd say it in my head a lot, but it took time of hitting the wall and turning to God and then recognizing, oh, He's with me in this and He's good. So, I don't know, what about you, Dannielle?
For me, I think the part of the question that stands out is how can I get it from my head to my heart? And I think the thing is we cannot get it there.
Mm-hmm.
Right.
We have to recognize that only God is actually capable of that process happening, of getting it. And He owns that. He owns it. And I think even the asking of the question is one of the essential first steps of that happening, is instead of asking it just to us, because we're not experts, right? But is to say, God, I can't feel your love.
Yeah.
I know you say, show me.
Yeah.
And he invites us to ask. He says, knock, 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 nag, nag, nag. The invitation to pursue Him to answer things is in Scripture. And I think this is one of those ones. It's like, okay, God, this is who you say you are. Show me.
Yeah.
And he's eager to do that. And I think that's a humble thing. It's not a prideful thing to say, show me. It's meaning I can't feel it.
Yeah.
Right.
And I need your help, Lord. Show me how much you love me.
Yeah.
And so I just think in the asking is an essential thing, and just keep asking and staying obviously vulnerable in community with people who do know his love.
Yeah.
Because oftentimes how I've experienced love in times of crisis or in times of hardship of any kind, it's been through encountering his love through others when he feels very far away.
Right.
Yeah. I agree with you. I really like where that question comes from, right? It's like, Lord, I believe, help me with my unbelief, in a sense, right? Help me to actually believe this thing that you say is true in my heart. I think that question of being able to really know God's love, right? I guess, like, how would you describe the way that you know that? Like, not the process so much, but like, what does it feel like to know that God loves you?
For me, I feel like that it's when I get to a place in which that I'm getting really honest about where I really am at some level that almost scares me to go there. And when I go there, instead of feeling what I expected, I actually feel God's compassion for me. I kind of was. That's for me. It's kind of like the way I've gotten there is not by kind of pushing through it or whatever. It's when I start asking kind of the questions like, how can this be? And getting down to those really raw areas, then I feel like I begin, and I don't know how I describe knowing it, except that it would be like I understand that he's there with me and I can tangibly sense that. And I'm always hoping for that, but I have had times where I went a long time and didn't feel that at all, and was just ramping up, trying to stay positive, trying to believe. And honestly, when I started having the transformation is when I kind of came undone more, and I actually trusted him with my pain and my questions at higher levels, and then I started knowing him a little bit more. So.
Yeah, I think sometimes that act of trusting before you necessarily feel something, right? Like that ends up producing more and more of that real heart knowledge that you end up having.
Yeah.
Sometimes it works the other way, right? Like God is pretty good about doing it whatever way that we need it most. But yeah, what do you think, Dannielle? How's it feel?
For me, how it feels, I would say it feels like being completely seen, understood, and accepted. That like he sees me and doesn't want to pull away from me.
Yeah.
And he understands. And it's like that being with someone, you can be with someone but not like be with them. Right. And it's like when I know that I'm feeling his love, I feel him with me in a way that I feel fully understood, and often feel like him feeling my pain along with me, or feeling my joy with me. It's not always pain, right? But it's like he shows you how he is really in it with you, literally. Most of the time that looks like me crying, even joyful tears.
Right.
I can't encounter his love and not sob.
Yeah.
Because I think there's no human capable of seeing as well as he sees.
Yeah.
And so to be seen that way, there's nothing that feels like that. And so that's what I would call, that's what it feels like for me.
Yeah.
To feel his love.
Yeah. As you're saying that, I think about actually how I can feel someone else's, like another person's care for me, and just sort of like different levels of depth in relationship. And so some people you're like acquainted with, and they can say, hey, how's it going? And you just have sort of that superficial level, and you might even, it might be very, very positive, but it kind of, you sort of both know it's staying at a particular level. And there's other people that it's a little deeper, and then a little deeper. And then with like, my really close friends, it's like, I know a couple things. One, they've demonstrated that they really, really do care about what I'm going to say. Like nothing that I say is going to make them run out the door or like make them, think less of me. Like none of that's going to be true. But furthermore, they actually really want to know. And so that there's this feeling of being seen, by this other person, being understood. And like, just as you're talking, I mean, I was just thinking, I think that's a lot of how it does feel with God when you're, getting deeper and deeper into relationship with him. Like you start to feel that, that safety, number one, but then also like, being able to feel understood and feel seen. And, that's one of the things I just love. That's one of the reasons why I was in the Vineyard in the first place, was because like a lot of times when I was getting prayer ministry, which is another great thing to do, of course, like that's what I felt. I felt like God was really, really showing me that he saw me, saw my situation. So, that's good.
One thing I thought about when you were saying that is that, we always, in the series, we talked about the whole thing of risking, right? The risking is loving. And I think what's happened sometimes is when we think of faith, we think of faith in the time we start feeling God's love, right? We start thinking, okay, now I'm in faith now, because now I'm feeling God's love. I know he loves me. But I think it's real important to understand faith is that place of getting vulnerable. Like it's not just, deciding something. It's faith requires you to stay in those questions and getting honest with your struggles. And that's where God comes in. And I remember one time I went through this run period and I was just felt like I was a million miles away from God, but I was still choosing to call him good. And when I got through it, I was thinking, finally, I'm better. And I felt like God said, oh, you've been exercising more faith than you ever have in your life in this season of darkness. I thought, would never thought of that. So now when I see someone struggling, thinking, I don't see them as though they need to get some faith, I think, no, they're expressing faith because they're not shutting down.
Yeah.
Because to me, a lot of times it's just not shutting down and not giving up, but not in a raw pick yourself up, but in a way that you're choosing to say, no, I need to experience God personally, and I'm going to stay with him until I can experience him.
Yeah, and I think that journey of going from head to heart is lifelong. I don't think anybody fully arrives. Yeah. And it's a process because we're human, and we have all of these like wounds that have happened to us relationally with people, the way we've been disappointed by people. And Jesus, God, the Holy Spirit has to come into that and restore that. And so that's a process.
Yeah, that's a good segue to our next question, which I'll kind of generalize a little bit, but this says, can you talk about loving and honoring people who are close to you, and that could be family members or others who are close to you, specifically that you have been hurt by in the past? And how does that look? How do we keep our hearts soft in a battle that is ruthless? And similarly, how do you love and honor people that are actually that we perceive as being toxic? What does that look like? And if there are boundaries to be drawn, how do we navigate that? So that's a whole bunch of questions, but and kind of mixed in there. But yeah, kind of that. I mean, I think that's something that we didn't address real directly in our series. I mean, and certainly in the second part of our series, we were talking a lot about just how expansive God's love was and how it, extends to everybody. And we're gonna talk some more about that later. But in this case, it's like, it's almost kind of like, is there a point where it's too expansive or too much?
Yeah. You go first, Dannielle. I'm sure you have wisdom on that.
Well, I just think about that first part of the question about how do you keep your heart soft, right?
Yeah.
That was the question.
Yeah.
Again, it's the same thing as going from the head to the heart. You can't keep your heart soft. But we very much have this free will that allows us to choose to either press into God desperately for help, or to do what our world and our bodies tell us is when someone's wronged us or made us angry or hurt us, is to be like, okay, I'm done. Mm-hmm. I don't need that. I only need what makes me feel good. And that can harden our hearts, right? But to turn to Jesus and be like, okay, like how do I not run away? How do I not just do that? And sometimes actually, and in the boundaries things, right? Sometimes we do have to end relationship if someone really is incredibly hurtful, Jesus doesn't ask us to be wounded that way by people.
Yeah.
But sometimes, right, he has a way for us to actually engage with that person that we would never have come up with on our own. And so I think actually the question is really brilliant. And how do we keep our hearts soft? It's like, don't engage at all if you notice your heart is hardening. You go to Jesus, you spend time with the Father until you have a soft heart, and then you can begin to hear him and begin to interact in the situation that's really hard. Because if you're approaching it already with the hard heart, it's just not going to end well, because you're already dealing with someone who is also probably has a hard heart, which is why all this stuff's coming out.
I think that's such a that is just not an answer that you'll hear from anywhere else. I think in a lot of ways, right? Because we're I don't know. We want there to be a solution. We want there to be, kind of a simple answer to those difficult situations. And I think, ultimately, what I hear you saying is like, okay, we've got to go back when something's challenging us, right, in our ability to love others. We've got to go back to the source. Right. We got to go back to Jesus, and we've got to figure out where our hearts are supposed to be at. And so that's not about sort of what the end answer is. Like, so in some cases, almost at all, right? Like sometimes you won't have any inkling of what that is at all, but you're coming back to a point where you have to say, okay, I have to go back to Jesus and wait on him to help me understand, or help give me something, right? And that's like a lot of work in a lot of ways, isn't it?
And it's usually not satisfying. In the moment. Being mean or shutting things down with the other person, that feels more satisfying.
We have, exercising our rights to whatever that is, right? Like, because it's like, well, somebody hurt me, I have the right to do X, Y, and Z back, right? Well, it's just justice, or it's, whatever.
Yeah, and I think the boundaries thing is something that back when I was a new Christian, that no one talked boundaries. And so I remember when the book Boundaries came out, which is a good practical book, it's like everybody like, oh my gosh, I can set boundaries, and is that okay? And I think oftentimes with boundaries, even if we understand we need to set boundaries, I think sometimes still it's looked at as, I've loved all I can now, and now it's time to set a boundary. And really, I think if you look at Jesus' life, he set boundaries all the time. He was always setting boundaries. He would not trust himself to other people. He'd leave when people wanted him to stay. He'd make these calls that he was led by the Holy Spirit, and his Father directed him. But the reality of it is that boundaries are part of love. And they're not, okay, I got to pull out the boundaries now because it's gotten so bad. It really should be, the more we grow in Christ, we set boundaries quicker, and because boundaries are designed to keep relationship and to keep your heart, to keep relationship between people, and to keep our hearts soft.
Yeah.
So what that boundary is, so I remember when boundaries came out, man, everybody's putting up like giant 12-foot walls. Like, I can set boundaries now, but you don't just pick your own boundaries, There's times I want a 12-foot wall boundary, and God says, no, you need about a 2-foot wall boundary here, and here's how that looks. Other times I didn't want a boundary, and he says, you need a big boundary. Yeah. And so the idea is you really have to have God's help in boundaries, but also understanding boundaries are love. They aren't, love didn't work, we got to put boundaries in. And I think if we start understanding that, God can start showing us and give us more permission. Because usually what happens is with somebody who we love deeply and we're connected to and we care about, we go beyond our capability. Right. We get to a spot that we emotionally are depleted, and so then we just cut off all relationship because we say, I gave it all I had, and then it's better than continuing going, but it's really, oftentimes it's because we went too far. And sometimes you do need a boundary to come back and just get caught up a little bit, but the idea is, how do I only have the boundary that God's asked me to with this person? Yeah. And but he's all about boundaries. It's not a weakness, like, oh, I couldn't love enough, so I need a boundary. It's part of loving. Yeah.
There's so much in what you just said there that I want to unpack. So the first of all, I would say, just think about Jesus. You're just bringing up like Jesus having boundaries and stuff. Like, one of the questions that I think is sort of subconsciously in our minds. And Tim Stagner, when he taught on this, was like very explicit about it, right? It's like, God, what are you going to ask me to do? Right? Like, are you going to ask me to do something crazy? And I think that question is sort of always in our minds. But I think the answer is like, well, no, I mean, Jesus always has, like, there are always limitations on what God asks us to do. There just are, right? Like, God isn't asking you to, I don't know, just to pick something. I mean, he's not asking you to heal every single person on planet Earth today, right? Like, so obviously there's some limit on what God's asking us to do. And the only question is, okay, where is that? And do you know where it is, right? And I love what you were saying about, like, a lot of times we've just run right past boundaries that God would have had us set a long time ago, except we weren't asking him about it in the first place. And that can happen usually the reason why that happens is because it actually feels really good, right? Like, if you're in a relationship and you want to go, like, you want to run through a boundary because, like, it actually is a good thing, right? A lot of times then that's when you end up thinking, oh wait, something happened and maybe I need to go backwards a little bit. Is that kind of a little bit?
Yeah,
what
I
you're
think
talking
you really have a hard time deciding how that is without God involved.
Yeah.
I would also say getting really good at understanding when you're going the wrong direction helps me. Like, when I began raging in my head like that, and I start counting up other things the person did, or I start finding myself waking up and thinking of it, I pretty well know somehow I crossed some line I need to get God's perspective on. So I wish I could just say I just sense it, feel it. No, usually it's because I find myself so close to judging and cutting that person off. And I think another thing I just have had to do is just keep reminding myself this is God's child that he loves deeply. Even if they're acting in ways that are really hard, it's like, if you know what it's like to be a parent, no matter where your kid's at, you have a love and you will not cut them off.
Yeah.
And to think I'm able to do that. I've had times where I think, oh, I'll cut them off. You don't have to, God. But it's like, no.
But I'm done.
The reality is what we have to get back to, because it destroys us if we do that. We're not made for that. And it doesn't allow God to move. But it doesn't mean we have to fix them or whatever. It just means that we have to really watch our heart, because not only does it torment us, it holds back the things that God might want to do in that person's life. So it has a big effect if you're having a hardened heart. So a lot of times it's just a big goal is just to not speak negatively, not to slander that person, not to vent when you shouldn't, or and confess when you do, because that's often the words reveal our hearts, but our words can change our hearts. Our restraint of our words can actually change our hearts. So it's that place of, you may not quite feel it yet, but the choice to say, I'm not going to let my heart get hardened here. I'm not going to judge that person. That puts you in a good position to be hearing God for what the boundary should be or how you should respond. So,
I really like that you mentioned again how to recognize the symptoms, right, of your heart hardening towards someone, because I think in the heat of the moment that can be very hard to do. You've learned it. You have a lot of wisdom in that. I think most of us, when we're really struggling in a relationship with someone, we can actually be convinced God is saying something to us when he may not be. And I think that because, it's just what humans do, right? The heart is a deceitful thing.
Right.
And so it's like, I think I would add to not just seeking God's wisdom, but seeking the wisdom of people who have deep relationship with God. So like you would be someone to go to. But we all have people in our life that are a little ahead of us, or maybe have walked through something, and that they know the Lord, but they also know what it's like to be in hardship, and to open up what you're going through with them in a way that you can then hear feedback, because we really can convince ourselves that God has told us to sacrifice in this way that maybe actually crossed the line, because our heart wants so badly. We want to be able to save people. We want to be able to rescue people. We want people not to be the toxic people. Like these
And we don't wanna
questions exist
fail.
because we want good.
Yeah.
Like people wouldn't have asked these questions if their hearts weren't actually wanting good for the situations
Yeah.
that led to these questions.
Right.
And that desire for goodness can actually cause us to overstep what God is doing. And God knows everything. He knows all the parts at play, and he's strategic.
Yeah.
He's strategic, and he's brilliant at what he does. And so it's like really listening to him and hearing from him on that also means listening to people around you.
Yeah,
And
absolutely.
not everybody, right?
Right.
You're mindful about who you choose, but
Yeah, I remember one time we had to set a real strong boundary with Debbie's mother, and I remember we had to write a letter out, and I thought it looked pretty good. But I ran it by Mark Pedersen. I said, "Could you and Gail look at this?" And he goes, "Well, a few things in here." And it was like I didn't realize I was trying to get justification. I want to put in my little attitude in the way I wrote the letter. And so it was really nice because I didn't need to say those things, and it wasn't going to help me. But having someone else look at it and say, "You don't realize your own heart here. You're still hurting from some of those things you've taken." And so just even having someone think through, how would I set that boundary and how would I go about it in a way that would not be the best way of doing it? Giving us some ideas on that, whether it be verbal or written, that is helpful.
yeah.
Yeah, I think sometimes, this is a question I have. So this wasn't listed, but as we're talking about it, sometimes it's hard to know the difference between kind of processing the stuff that you're going through in relationships, right? Especially like here in in a smaller church setting.
Yeah.
And everybody, a lot, relationships cross all sorts of different people, and sort of what's the difference between kind of processing how that's going with someone else versus what's sort of moving into the stuff that you were talking about, David, earlier about like slander. Maybe it's not slander, but maybe it's just what's
Venting.
not necessary, venting, which is what you need to do too, right? So how do we know the difference?
I would actually say it's like, what's your motivation? So when I have crossed into the line of maybe venting or what I'm really after is I want to hear you say that I'm
you're right.
and what a terrible person that person is.
Yeah.
And all my information is pointed towards making sure how right I am and how wrong the other person is.
Mm-hmm.
Where the other way, where it's really about addressing my own hurt and need, the conversation will be about me more than the other person. It'll be like, this is
that I'm struggling,
this person.
right? Yeah.
And it might even still name their actions,
Yeah.
right? But the motivation of my heart is like, is to express how badly it's hurting me.
Yeah.
And that I need help because of the way I've been hurt.
Right. And I think it's been on your stages too. I mean, if you're in crisis mode because you've been damaged at levels you can't quite breathe, and you're trying to figure it out, and you're angry and you're just undone, all I'd say is you always want to make sure that you're finding a person who has enough spiritual maturity that when you tell them these things, it will be for everybody's benefit. So if it benefits only me, in my opinion, or the other person, it's not. It has to benefit both people, and you want that kind of person. We'll say back to you, hey, here's what can still understand where you're at, but because sometimes you're not able to quite be that concise, right?
Yeah.
You're just undone, and you're hurting so bad, and you're going to leak. You're going to say things that are wrong. Yeah. And as long as you have a person who will graciously speak truth to you and they're looking for the best for both parties, then that's a good person to talk to.
I think just on sort of on the other side of that, being somebody who can listen to somebody else process and go through difficulty in relationship without judging the people that they're talking about, right? Like being able to sort of create spaces where it's okay for someone to, say difficult things that they're going through, and maybe even name hard things, but not have that change, and be careful, right? Like be careful about that changing your own judgments and perceptions and things like that. I think that's been something that is difficult, but I think when I've been able to find myself in some of those situations, it's like, oh yeah, that's really useful. Right. That's really good to be able to do. So, God calls us to do that as well, right? To be on the other side of that process. So, yeah.
just want to add on the part of like toxic. That can mean a lot of things. Like,
Yeah.
I just don't want to slip by. Like,
Yep.
there are certain times in relationships where it's a hard line. Like if you're being harmed physically, emotionally, mentally by someone, you don't stay.
Yeah.
You go and you get help and you leave. You don't remain in that situation for the good of both people. And so I just wanted to touch on that, because toxic can mean a lot of things. And if it's that level of toxic, it's not okay. And Jesus isn't okay with you being treated that way, and neither is God. You know, to be abused is a form of oppression. And we know that like God is very opposed to oppression.
Yeah.
And so like first step in those things isn't how the boundary is go away, get out of the situation in those cases.
Yeah.
You know, it's,
there are times when stop is the right answer, right? Like,
And I just think that that's really important to mention, just because I know when people are in really hard spaces, they use vague language.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Because it can be hard to name abuse, but you can say, oh, this person is toxic to me, and it feels less, you know what I mean? Like to claim abuse is a hard thing.
Yeah.
Yeah.
No, appreciate you adding that clarification, definitely. Okay, let's go to another general topic here. So this one is something that we kind of have talked about through the series, but I don't think we've kind of dived into it quite as deeply as maybe we would like to. So this is just, how do we love others who aren't like us? But kind of specifically, I maybe break it down into a couple different pieces, and I'll start with loving people who don't look like us or aren't in our socioeconomic class. So sort of people who are just cultural, in our culture, but sort of in a different subgroup than what we might find ourselves in. How do we get started loving people in that realm?
I would say it's one of the weaker areas of my life. I mean, quite honestly, I think it's something that I can't speak of in the way I wish I could. The ways that I've noticed I've had growth in that area is there are certain relationships that you're going to run across, and you're going to have plenty of places to figure out how to love that person because you're in interactions, you're in commitment. But often you have to be pretty intentional because our natural makeup is it's like the thing that goes against our flesh almost the most, in my opinion. There's something even bizarrely normal about wanting to be around people like myself.
Yeah.
It feels very good, and I'm not saying there's anything wrong with that. And so there's a spot of all the pressures I have. Why would I want to be around somebody who's different? Because it's just so exhausting. There's that natural feeling. But I also know how rich it is if you do it, and how it takes you to new levels. So I've actually tasted that it's not like a duty that we have to just kill our flesh and do these things. It actually is something that is so good, it's worth doing. But I would say usually you have to have some degree of intentionality, because in our culture, being homogenous and staying with the people you know happens so naturally. You have to be intentional, and I think it has to come from something from God. It feels like I've never been. I don't know if I could ever be motivated as a secular person to do this very well. I think I would just
certainly for it to be sustainable, right? Like it's one thing to decide.
To make myself feel good and less guilty, but as far as having it be part of my life, of what I want to live like, it would be something that God has to motivate. So for me, that's the intentionality is something that. I've learned you have to be pretty intentional at it, and you have to, like we've talked about, there's some big stretching involved. And you have to be ready you have to be looking to say, I want to be stretched, and then how to bring God into that stretching when it happens.
Yeah, that's good.
Yeah, I think that's one of those questions that I wish we had a simple answer for, because then, it would solve most of the world's problems.
Right, yeah. How do we love people who aren't like us? Yeah.
Yeah, I think it starts off with kind of this answer that at the beginning. It's if experiencing God's love for me is being seen by him, I think loving any kind of other, whoever your other is, sometimes our other is just someone who doesn't live in the same house as we do, right? Begins with just seeing.
Yeah.
Seeing people, and seeing people, what does that mean? Not just physically seeing them, although it starts with that. A lot of us go about our day without even looking who's around us.
Yeah.
Just go to the grocery store and start looking at people when they're shopping, and you can begin to see things about people. But then seeing also, I think, incorporates understanding, like trying to understand a certain group. So if there's like, if, whoever had asked this question, is there a certain group that is agitating you? Like, I feel like that question came out of somewhere, right? This person surely has some other in mind of how to love.
Yeah.
And it's like, well, try to start to understand that group, right? Whatever the group is, whether it's people who are richer than you or poorer than you or different skin color than you. Begins with understanding. And it's like, I was just recently reading this essay that somebody wrote about why they write fiction. And it was really interesting because their main motivation is that it helps us understand another better when you can do it in the context of this fictional story, because it's very non-confrontational. You're reading something that's not,
Right.
And I think that is a huge part of learning to love is coming to understand. And like, it's like the do your homework. We hear that a lot. That's for a reason, because the more informed you are, the less likely you are to develop your own conclusions that aren't really right. And you're going to be set up better to love when God brings that person into you. Because you can't just force yourself to a table. You can't just be like, I'm going to go be friends with all these people. I mean, some people probably could. There's
can.
some personalities that can pull that off.
A small percentage of people can actually do that.
Some people really do have that gift. But for the most of us, it's like God will bring to us, and I think that the people who asked this question, like their hearts are probably being prepared for something God wants to do. And so like, how do you participate with this is like to begin trying to understand that certain, because I doubt it's the whole world, whoever asked that question.
Right.
You know what I mean?
Right.
Like,
that's right. There's a specific application, most likely.
Yeah,
right?
and I think that that's true for all of us. I think that you have that, I have that, David has that, like the certain groups get put on our heart for a reason.
So I was actually thinking about this question specifically earlier, and I felt like God kind of gave me I don't know, it's not an answer I wasn't really expecting.
A revelation, a vision.
No, I don't know about that. No pictures involved or anything, right? But what I felt like he said was like, well, actually, everyone's different than you, right? And one of the things I thought about was kind of how through COVID, how very often, like when I would talk to people for the first time in a while, like, sort of that first conversation after COVID happened, when I would talk to someone, it was interesting that like almost everybody kind of like expected you to agree with whatever they thought.
Yes.
Right? Like, did you notice that?
Yes,
right? Everybody kind of like, and I think a lot of that was because you're so desperate for that it feels good. Like when you have alignment, especially when there's so much turmoil and chaos and stuff, it's like, oh, it'd be so great if we could just agree on this. But people would just sort of expect that you agreed with them, even over something that was clearly so, not just like polarizing, but I mean, there's so many different opinions that you could have. And like really actually the chance of somebody agreeing with you 100% on it was approximately zero, right? So, but we just kind of wanted that. And I felt like God was just like, one thing we can do is actually notice differences even in the people that we feel most comfortable with, right? Like try to notice that, oh, you know what? Like they actually feel a little differently about this, or they approach this thing a little differently than I do, even your own family members. And as a practice to be able to like see that and appreciate that, right? Maybe even draw it out, right? Like don't assume that they're the same as you. And as you do that, I think you're able to kind of grow that muscle, right? Like you're starting with people who are kind of safer to do that with, and that might help. So I don't know. I don't know if that's helpful.
I think the challenge is to notice without judging.
Yes, that's the whole thing. To be able to notice without judging.
We're actually kind of good about noticing differences, but we want to judge them and label them as good or bad, or as wanted or unwanted.
Yeah.
And so it's like, oh, if you notice yourself judging a lot, it's like, oh, this is a time to go to God and say, why? Why is my impulse to judge when I see something?
Yeah, and I think your two things that you talk about is getting to know who that person is and trying to think what they're like. And I think there's a relational side to that. But I know for me, COVID, when I thought I was with biracial kids, I thought, oh yeah, I'm pretty caught up on things. And man, in the middle of that, I realized I did not really understand a lot that I thought I understood.
Yeah.
And quite honestly, the environment was like not an easy place to know how you do that. But what was so cool was there was so much resources of people without emotion telling their story out there right now to learn history and all that. And so, like you say, you can take a step by choosing to take time. Because I have to this day, I have certain things that I can barely watch because it's about a group of people, whether it be an African American or it can be immigrants or refugees or whatever, and I just hardly can take it in. But I have to pray, and many times God will say, yeah, just stay with me and watch this documentary and read up on this or listen to this story. And to me, that has been helpful because you're able to go quite a ways. And then when you're interacting, you have a much better context to allow it to be much better interactions as you let people tell their stories.
Yeah.
So,
and I think you touched on something essential is you can't love others and avoid pain.
Right. Yeah.
Right. That is true.
Both, but just the pain of watching the documentary, right? You're not even in relation with that, but the pain that causes, and so there's no way to even love at a distance without encountering pain, not emotional pain.
If you have any investment at all, right?
Yes.
Then there's that possibility of pain.
And that's where I think this whole thing of the spiritual side of it is to not develop ideology or just kind of information, but to understand it's going to require you to have God in it with you as you come into people's lives and recognize what they've gone through. And it's like, we just have to make choices. That's what I'm saying about you. There has to be intentionality to how you begin moving that direction.
Mm-hmm. Yeah, so maybe the second part of that question, and we've talked about it a little bit already, but when it comes to loving people who, really do think differently than you, politically, culturally, maybe they're from a different country or they have different morals, different religious background, what have you. How can we stay engaged with people who see things so differently than we might, without necessarily totally throwing out our own, what we think, right? But how can we do that, you think?
I think humility is essential. I think that's the only way is to practice, and it takes practice to be humble, because it's laying down your right to be right if you're going to love someone, and by right I mean correct. Maybe you are correct, and maybe they are wrong, but if you want to actually love them, you have to lay down hearing them say you're right. You know what I mean? Which that's really hard to do.
That is hard.
Because I don't know. And I don't even think you can be patient without being humble. All the other things we know that are associated with love, that's why humble's in the Bible so much.
Yeah.
Yeah, the thing about that is that, laying it down and kind of okay, I want to be right. The problem that at least for me, it's I don't want to, I want to, there is a proud part of me. I want to be right in that conversation and be the winner. Most of mine is I don't want to lose truth, and if I just become this person who just loves everybody, I'm going to lose truth. And this truth is really precious to me.
Yeah.
So I want them to get my truth. And I think the reality of it is I do want them to get my truth.
There's a good part of that, definitely.
I have a good part that I want them to get. Now, I may be wrong in that, and that's where humility comes. I may find out later as I interact that it was not quite as on the truth as I thought. But I think we believe, so for me, I've had to kind of think, okay, wait, how does truth transfer? And it doesn't transfer when I have contempt for a person.
Yep.
As soon as I have contempt for another person, it shuts down truth from being able to transfer, and that person from being here. Once I judge that person or I raise myself up, truth no longer can flow. So I've had to kind of think, okay, the reason I need to humble myself is because that is actually the best way of allowing what is true to happen, right? And I think sometimes we fear, okay, what if I have to change my mind on truth? And that's kind of hard to think about that possibility, but it has to be a spot that you begin recognizing you defending your truth by judging the other person, try to hold on to it, is always destructive, right? And so I think that's where, as Christians, we can be people who live according to the truth and boldly share it and what we believe, and we want other people to experience that as well, but coming against them or judging them actually cuts them off from any chance of truth transferring back and forth to each other.
Yeah, kind of really missing the whole point in a lot of ways, right? Like being, I mean, we could just go, there's so many different levels of truth and priorities of truth and all that. But I mean, if we just go straight to something like Jesus is the Son of God, right?
Right.
That we know, right? We know is truth.
Right.
Okay. And if somebody disagrees with that really strongly, like what's our job in that, right? Like is our job to beat them into submission until they agree that Jesus is God? Is that the approach? Or, what is the way of love in that? And I think a lot of times, we take much, much more minor things than that ultimate truth, right? That I just said. I mean, we take super duper minor things and we blow them up into just this huge, like, this is the hill I'm gonna die on, and I'm gonna kill you over it, right? To do it, and it does. That's why I so love the quote that I think you brought up, Dannielle, in the series from Pete Scazzaro. It's like, love is the measure of your spiritual maturity, period, right? Like that is it. It's not your ability to articulate every fine point of theology or to be correct in your political views, certainly not that. It's really about love. And so I think just being able to prioritize that, being able to come to a place where we actually believe that that's the most important thing. I think that's the whole deal in a lot of ways. Yeah. Okay, so one more here, and this is a pretty interesting one. This says, "How do we love others?" Actually, I think I might have misplaced that. How do we love others who aren't our enemies? Okay, so people who we might not specifically have something against, but are rather enemies of others that we care about. So it's one thing to turn my other cheek, but what happens when the cheek that was struck was somebody I care about? How do we love in that situation?
Well, I mean, I think to me that question is pressing into that whole idea of oppression, right? Like all the ways that we hurt others is to make them lower than us, right? That whole dynamic. So I realize they're probably not talking about an oppressed person, although they may be. And I think this is one of those things where I wish I could give a blanket answer and just say, this is what you do, but we can't do that. I mean, it really requires going to Jesus and saying, what do I do? Seeking wisdom from others. What do I do in this situation? Because every situation is different.
It's different. Yeah, absolutely. Yeah.
But I think it's a brilliant question because I think most often we're willing to tolerate a lot more than we're willing to allow to happen to our loved ones. The mama bear or the defender rises up.
Do not mess with my kids.
Like, I've been going through that, like where like experiencing direct insults hurt me. But when someone insults someone I love, like I get so mad. Like I'm surprised at the level of anger that'll come up in those situations. And so it's just like, I think I wish we could just say, here is the answer to that situation.
Yep.
I think there's I agree that it's you have to figure out what Jesus is saying. I do think there's some helpful things, at least I do, when if somebody is, you guys all know this kind of thing, where there's somebody who is, they don't like the person that you're a friend with. They're mad at that person. They're embittered towards that person. Maybe they're saying things, they leak things about that person. And it's very awkward because you're not sure they seem to love you, but they seem to have this other person's an enemy of theirs, right? They're an enemy towards that person. So I think in my mind, a lot of what I have to do in that spot is I have to pretend that person is in the conversation with us. He's like, they're listening in. So what am I going to say to honor that person? And also, if that person's a Christian or not a Christian, it makes a big difference. So if it's a Christian, I think to myself, wait a minute, if someone's speaking slanderously or leaking ugly things, I should be able to be very direct and say, you got to stop that. That's wrong. Lovingly, maybe pull them aside so it doesn't shame them. But I've had people do that to me before. I'm talking about something, and they go, "Sounds like you don't." It makes me feel like, and I go, "Oh yes, I am." So we have to, as Christians, be able to do that, and to say no. You got to stop it. It gets more complicated when it's a non-Christian or something like that, because I think for them, sometimes silence. Sometimes that's the best thing you can do. We might see that differently. I mean, there's things you can say to stop that direction, but you really realize I'm not going to be able to change much here. So to me, there's always a bit of a dance when that happens, because it's very awkward, and it will affect your relationship with that person if they stay in that place, because that person is connected to someone you love, and so you might have to set certain boundaries that God gives you. So,
well, and I think that, like in that question, right, the enemy of the person you love, you might not even know that enemy. You're just hearing, right? You're just hearing how they're impacting the person in front of you. And so I think that makes it even more complicated, because it would be even easier to jump on the wagon of disliking them. But I also think you can't dismiss, you can't be listening to someone and dismiss that this person's treating them badly. Right. And so I think, like, who did God put in front of you? It's that person. And the challenge is how to love them well, and how to move that person that's hurt in front of you toward Jesus in that context. And then, Jesus tells us to pray for the enemy, our enemies. And I think that includes the enemies of those we love. But it also doesn't mean inaction. I think, again, that's why I tried to say, like, there's... Because sometimes we're actually called to stand up for people who are being hurt. And so, like, depending on the situation, God might give you an actual action item to take in a situation, which, I could make up a whole bunch of scenarios we don't really want to, but he could give you a very clear next step, which is for that person. And so when I say go to Jesus, that's what I'm talking about. It's like, ask, like, what is your role in helping in this situation?
Right.
What does that look like? And I think realizing, to the point about, like, these people are all, God's children and loved by God. They're all equally loved, right? So how do you, a lot of times the action that we want to take is sort of solely based on our own anger and our own desire for retribution or even just saving somebody out of it. And that could be appropriate. But I think one important thing to realize is just, like, okay, if that's really happening, right? If you've got somebody hurting someone else, that's the wrong thing for both of those people, right? Like, it's not just the wrong thing for the victim; it's also the wrong thing for the abuser. And and to at least have a dialogue with Jesus about that, right? Like, okay, so there are two people, or there's multiple people, or there's a group, or whatever. Like, I might be more called to one person, but having that sort of mindset of, okay, but everybody involved here is loved by God. And so what does he want for them, and being able to pray into that. But that is a hard, I mean, a lot of what we've talked about is being able to kind of slow down, kind of stop. I mean, we haven't said it explicitly, but in our conversation, it's like a lot of it's been about, we need to stop and go back to Jesus, go back to the source of love. And most of the time that requires overcoming some initial very strong emotional response to something, and it is you don't have any stronger one than if it's about somebody that you care about.
And I think I'm sorry. I think the thing is that when I start hearing us talk, I think this sounds exhausting, but it is it's hard. But I want to just emphasize those things that you go through after a conversation like that, and you turn to God and you figure out what he's saying and you get settled. it does way more than get you through that one situation. It allows you to have a deeper reservoir of compassion and understanding that you didn't have before. So to me, that's encouraging, but it is, like you say, I think you're right. And I was thinking about those kind of situations. I'm finding myself, not only am I trying to figure out what I should say, I'm stirred up myself because it's hitting something in me, and now I'm all worked up about this. I'm taking offense for somebody, and I shouldn't be, and all those things. But all that environment is normal. I mean, it's not like you're messed up. It's like that's the environment that God wants to come in and settle you and help you. But it shows you how, without turning to God, this stuff, you just end up becoming homogeneous. You just stick around the people you know, and you cut off the people you don't that cause you problems. It just goes that way so naturally. But when you do the opposite, the depth of what you start understanding about God and the ability to love is really worth it.
Yeah.
If I cut you off, what were you going to say? You can't remember now.
Oh, it's something silly, I'm sure.
You've said so many silly things today. I mean, clearly.
I was just thinking, like our like impulse is always to demand satisfaction. I just think that, the old, like, I demand satisfaction. So we have to duel. Like, that came from, because it's still in us. The humans demand satisfaction in the moment of when there's like real struggle. And like, this is something I have firsthand experienced.
Have wrestled with.
Is like, in the heat of the situation, going to God usually doesn't feel satisfying. The act of going to him does not feel satisfying. Like, when you're trying to decide which to do.
It doesn't even feel real a lot of times.
Yeah, it doesn't even feel real. The word satisfying is really just because it would, like, in my mind, I would fantasize about all the satisfying actions I could take with this person that's hurt me, right? And to choose, like, to go to God when it doesn't feel satisfying is really hard. Yeah. It's not easy. It's actually really hard. And sometimes, like, even after you've done it, like, I'll feel more at peace. My heart isn't racing, like those kinds of things. And then afterwards, as soon as I'm, like, out of prayer mode, the temptation to be satisfied comes right back. And so, like, the practice of continuing to go to God, choosing him, and I don't do it successfully all the time. Sometimes I just plain out choose to be satisfied by venting unkindly, has this huge reward of building my relationship with God.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah.
Like, I'm just selfish and self-motivated. And really why I keep going back over and over and over is because I can feel it doing something internally to me that I can't even always name, but I do know it's like, oh, I am growing closer to God in this. I am growing in trust in him to actually be my defender, to be my provider, to reconcile all things, maybe not while I'm alive, but that grows only when I choose him over the satisfying thing.
Yeah.
Yeah, so I think it's a great way to just bring it back full circle here and wrap it up. I mean, it really is like, kind of going back to that whole question of knowing that God loves you. How does that happen? How do you get that from your head to your heart, right? Like, so much of that actually just comes from living life in a way where you keep going back to Jesus in hard situations and hard circumstances and when it doesn't feel satisfying. And there is this slow, steady work of God below the surface, of just being able to root you more and more in his love, right? And I think it's definitely true that for me, so much of the way that I know that he loves me is because I've gone through those things and I've been able to see that he's faithful. And, when I've just, even when I've just done a little bit to go back to him, I've seen that he cares about my situation, right? He cares about how I respond to someone else, not because he's interested in me being the most moral person or in me being the most correct or anything like that, but because he cares about me. He cares about how well I'm doing, and he wants me to do, he wants me to be well as possible. And he loves us, and that's how we do this. So, all right, any other closing thoughts, or we have pretty good discussion here, I think.
That's pretty good.
Yeah.
I think
thought I have had all during this whole series is how the two really are love God, love others, are even more connected. I always said they've been connected, like it's always connected. But I mean, at levels that I've never really understood before, that if you begin saying, I want to love other people the way God is, it takes you into these kind of places and you are stretched. But it's not because, I'm so messed up. It's because that's the very design of how you grow. Mm-hmm. And so that those things are just, and I just wasn't taught that as a Christian. I was taught, get with God, get it all built up, and then you'll get it all down, and then you love people or something like that. Some kind of, where I didn't realize you had to have that, you had to live in that context of trying to figure out, how do I not judge this person? How do I not write this person off? How do I not condemn this person because I'm not allowed to? And in that context, that's when you're stretched. But that is actually where you're expressing faith. And so I think that's something that has come home to me more than ever during the series. Like, wow, it is absolutely married. Mm. We cannot say, I'm just going to go for information as a Christian, this and that, or whatever. It's required. You must love others as Christ loved you.
Yeah. All right. Well, thanks for joining us, everybody. Thank you, David and Dannielle, for taking time out to talk. And yeah, we love you guys, and we'll see you here soon. Thanks.